All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're looking at a completely radical premise from our source text. It proposes that the English language isn't just some practical tool we use to chat with one another, but that it was creatively engineered as a literal system of magical influence. The author argues this influence spans all the way from subtle psychological conditioning right down to absolute spiritual enslavement. I mean, could the words we use every single day actually be using us? It's a heavy, deeply fascinating concept that forces us to question the very foundation of how we think.
So, the million-dollar question we have to ask here is the English language actually a tool for spellcasting? I know, it sounds straight out of a fantasy novel, but as we begin our descent from the visible surface of everyday language, we're going to see how history, etymology, and psychology all intertwine to give our words an almost undeniable, spell-like power over reality. We use words on autopilot, rarely stopping to consider the historical weight or the intentional design behind the syllables we're just projecting into the air.
All right, Section 1, the magic of English.
The word magic itself actually traces all the way back to the Greek magikos and the Latin magicus, directly associated with the magi, that ancient priestly class known for mysticism. Well, our source text points out that English has absorbed these mystical roots over centuries. Just consider the dual meaning of the word spell. On the one hand, to spell out a word is simply forming it letter by letter, right? But historically, it also literally means casting a magical incantation. The author connects these two definitions, suggesting that literacy and speaking are subtly linked with casting intentions out into the world. When you speak, you're producing a very deliberate result. You are vibrating the air to manifest a thought into physical reality.
And we see this magic baked right into the structure of the language too. Take the word sentence. Sure, it's a basic grammatical structure, but wait, it's also a legal judgment that dictates a severe consequence. A judge literally sentences someone. They use words to strip away physical freedom and bind a person to a cell. According to the text, this duality is absolutely no accident. It shows how structural language holds real-world binding power over our physical lives, basically treating syntax as a form of societal law.
The source also gets into phonetic resonance. Just think about how the soft consonants in a word like flicker or whisper naturally evoke this gentle, delicate feeling in your body. Now contrast that with the harsh, sharp sounds in crash or clang. These phonetic sounds evoke totally primal emotional reactions in us. They function a lot like verbal incantations or ancient mantras that alter our emotional state without us even realizing it's happening. The vibration of the language itself is literally tuning our nervous system.
Moving on to Section 2, Psychology and Social Control.
So, moving beyond just etymology, the text explores how language shapes our perception of reality to influence mass behavior. By tweaking the context, politicians and the media can completely blur the lines between concepts like freedom and security, and they often use that to convince the public to willingly trade the former for the latter. Similarly, using a euphemism like collateral damage instead of civilian casualties completely sanitizes the grim reality of war. It creates this psychological buffer. It uses cognitive dissonance to alter public acceptance, allowing society to tolerate actions that, if described plainly, would be universally condemned.
The text actually grounds these concepts in George Orwell's Newspeak from 1984. And the premise here is terrifyingly simple. By restricting and inverting vocabulary, you restrict imagination. If a regime actively scrubs the words required to articulate rebellion, dissent, or true freedom, it becomes cognitively impossible for the populace to even imagine those things. You literally cannot build a philosophical concept in your mind if you don't have the linguistic building blocks to construct it.
But hey, it's not just politics, it's commerce too. The text argues that advertising acts as a highly potent form of cognitive entrapment. Think about corporate slogans. Through sheer relentless repetition across all our media, these phrases act like modern-day incantations. They bypass our logical filters and they condition our consumer identity. They create an artificial sense of fulfillment that's tied entirely to buying products, rather than genuine human connection or internal peace. We're essentially programmed to associate our self-worth with brand catchphrases.
Which brings us to Section 3, Weaponizing our words. The author outlines this incredibly clinical, step-by-step progression for how language gets weaponized to maintain control. It starts with Step 1, labeling. By calling individuals threats, aliens, or vermin, you completely strip them of human nuance. And that naturally leads right into Step 2, euphemisms. Dark actions are given these sterile, bureaucratic names, like ethnic cleansing, to mask the horrific reality of the atrocities being committed. Finally, Step 3 is the tragic result, institutionalized brutality. Language normalizes the violence so effectively that it eliminates human empathy altogether. It makes cruelty not just acceptable, but systematically routine to the masses.
And this devastating progression is achieved by creating deep psychological divides. Divisive terminology enforces social hierarchies by subtly assigning superior value to dominant cultures, all while stripping marginalized groups of their humanity. By defining us versus them, language turns into a tool that keeps societies fractured, distracted, and easily controlled. When we're busy fighting each other over labels, we rarely look up to see who defined the labels in the first place.
So I want you to just pause for a second and really think about this start question from the text. Are we speaking the language, or is the language speaking us? Are our thoughts actually our own, or are they totally boxed in by the vocabulary we were handed the day we were born? Hold on to that thought, because we are about to plunge into the deepest, most radical part of the author's argument.
Okay, buckle up for Section 4, the unseen architect.
Now, according to the source, the ultimate manipulator of language isn't human sociology or some corrupt politician. The text proposes the existence of an ancient, malevolent intelligence, an unseen entity that predates mankind. The author claims this entity uses language as its absolute primary instrument of control, operating entirely behind the scenes to feed off human despair and subjugation. It's a massive, supernatural claim that shifts the blame for our linguistic prison over to a cosmic force designed specifically to keep humanity in the dark.
The author argues that this entity has systematically inverted our language over millennia. The text claims that words originally meant for true spiritual liberation have been slowly corrupted to ensure psychological bondage. Beautiful concepts like duty, honor, and loyalty get twisted by this force into rigid mechanisms of submission. It ensures that our compliance masquerades as virtue. We're basically tricked into policing ourselves, completely believing we're being righteous when we're actually just obeying.
The source breaks down this entity's alleged goals. First up, to hollow out the soul by replacing authentic human meaning with endless, bureaucratic servitude. Second, to corrupt love and connection into transactional tools of obligation and fear. And ultimately, the goal is to completely erase the divine spark of humanity altogether, cutting us off from our true spiritual potential. By controlling the frequency of our words, the entity allegedly controls the frequency of our very existence.
And this leads to a genuinely terrifying concept proposed by the text. Language becomes the executioner of imagination. The claim here is that by eliminating or twisting words of true liberation, this entity makes absolutely sure that we cannot even conceive of an escape route. The prison is perfect precisely because its walls are made of the very thoughts we think. We are the inmates and the wardens, locked in a cell of syntax.
All right, Section 5, Reclaiming Our Language.
Despite those pretty dark depths we just explored, the author does provide some actionable paths to wake up from this linguistic enslavement. First, we have to actively recognize the illusion of the language we use daily. We need to question the definitions we take for granted. Second, we must unleash forbidden thoughts. You have to allow yourself to think beyond the rigid boundaries of acceptable society and explore concepts without judgment. And finally, we must actively redefine our words with genuine truth, stripping away the centuries of manipulation to find their core meaning. The author believes that humanity's unbreakable spirit is our absolute ultimate defense against this manipulation. By protecting our divine spark through entirely authentic expression, we purify our words. When we speak with unfiltered, unmanipulated truth, the text claims we break those invisible chains of control, starving the entity of its power. Truth, spoken clearly, acts as an antidote to the spell.
Which brings us to our final, deeply provocative question. Will you let your words be dictated, or will you reclaim your voice? The text challenges us to consciously examine every single phrase we utter. Because if our reality is built on language, then owning your words literally means owning your mind. Take a hard look at the language you use today and ask yourself, who is really doing the speaking?